Okay, so this is Learning Pod 1.2 for Module 1. And what we're talking about here is, just realised something didn't show up, Praxis, which is a core concept in your assessment tasks and the whole unit. And we're going to look at that through the work of Paulo Freire, because he's the guy that really pushed the concept of praxis. All right. This painting is one done by an artist, I think he's Brazilian. The link to the picture is further on. And it does appear in a UN document, that's right. So what I want you to start off this lecture pod thinking about is the concept of critical consciousness. All right. And what it says up here, the Kirkwood reading is in the extra reading section of section C, is that education, or the act of knowing, as Freire calls it, is an ongoing research program into aspects of people's experience and its relationship to wider social, economic, and political factors. All right. So in becoming knowledgeable, in becoming educated in the process of learning, what is happening is tied to your experiences and how that connects to your wider world. All right. Empowerment in Freire's world is very closely tied to the process of becoming critical, developing what this critical consciousness involves understanding the nature of power and the way in which it permeates our lives and how you potentially can challenge it with the skills and knowledge that you have. All right, so we're going to come back to this idea later on as we lead into concept of praxis. We're going to have a little bit of a chat about Paulo first. So Paulo Freire was a Brazilian educator and philosopher. He eventually ended up in New York, but still worked with the working class poor in Brazil most of the time. His most influential work, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, was originally written in 1968 in Portuguese. It's been translated many times, published many times. The library have lots of different editions of it. They have different forwards by supporting authors, but essentially the text is the same thing. All right. It's dense. It's esoteric. I would encourage you to have a read of it. I know that one of the third year social work units does actually frame a lot of their learning also around this concept. But it's not vital that you memorize all his ideas. All right. Instead, read his writing as a way of learning how to write. Okay. So, pedagogy of the press. What does this mean? So basically, pedagogy is the method and practice of teaching. All right. It's what we as teachers think about in designing a unit like this. It's perhaps our philosophy as an educator, but it's also part of your self-reflection and insight into learning is to think about what kind of teachers you enjoy. All right. What kind of methods and practice in that teaching process speak to you? Which ones don't speak to you or have a negative, disempowering effect. All right. So if we break down the second part of that, when we're talking about pedagogy of the oppressed, so this is oppressed or minority groups traditionally positioned as subjects of study. We must study the poor people or the working class. We have learnt that the working class people are depressed or don't have the economic resources. All right, so that's the traditional way of putting them as the subjects of study. Instead, what the pedagogy of oppressed is turn those people into objects, or rather people doing the study. All right, so taking it from that detached other to being part of the process. All right. So Freire challenged the traditional education structure as elitist, as maintaining power for the power structures that exist between the rich and the poor, that kind of thing. Saying that without education, we cannot enter the struggle as objects in order later to become subjects. All right, so it's about transforming education to something that allows that power from the beginning. That's where the TAP framework comes into play. So Freire's main, I guess, philosophical discussion revolves around a transformation between what we call a banking model of education through to consciousness and freedom. So in traditional education, the approach to learning is rooted in the notion that all students need to do to learn is consume information fed to them by a professor or a teacher and be able to memorize and store it. Your HSC learning is often like this a lot, or those of you that have studied overseas and have crammed for many, many exams. So that heavy exam-based study is often about the banking model of education. So the banking model of education is a metaphor where students are seen as containers in which educators must put knowledge, right? So you're a bank. The teacher is putting the money in the money box and you're going to get smarter just by doing this. So the banking model of education reinforces a lack of critical thinking and knowledge ownership in students, which in turn ends up reinforcing oppression. In other words, you can only learn in the banking model when somebody else allows you that access to the knowledge, right? You can't just learn it without a teacher. That's the position it takes. So Freire challenges this by arguing instead that education should be about the development of active intentional awareness of others, of the world, and of the self, both past and present. So he talks about the permanent search of people together with others for their becoming more fully human in the world in which they exist. So in this sense, we're moving to consciousness in that we begin to realize our position in the world. We develop self-reflection, the ability for insight, to look back at our past and see where we were unempowered, disempowered, and to look at the present to see how we're becoming more empowered, and then I guess to look forward to see where education is leading us. Often the oppressed feel oppressed, but they don't know why. One of the metaphors that Freire uses for this, and I think it occurs later on, is that you're hungry, you know you're hungry, but you don't quite know why you're hungry, all right? You need the insight in order to answer that question of why am I hungry? I skipped breakfast. I didn't eat enough at lunch. I ignored the protein and went straight for the chocolate, all right? So that insight, self-reflection to know why you are in a certain place is what consciousness and freedom are about, all right? And we can only challenge that if we have the right framing of learning and education to support that. And if you notice, when I flick between the pictures, we've got teacher-led learning and we've got the students in a much more comfortable situation. In previous classes, I've been able to take everybody outside to sit under a tree where you relax and get away from, this is what we do in a classroom. So, Freire frames all his ideas within conscientization. All right, this is a horrible word. I don't like saying this word, but basically it's the process of developing a consciousness. And the picture to the left of the screen is one that's plucked out of various human rights declarations. So everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. All right, so that freedom to think is what conscience is about, and to make judgments yourself. For Freire, critical consciousness is the ability to intervene in reality in order to change it. All right, I can recognize what I see and why I see it and why I'm feeling like that, and that allows me to change the world to be a better place. All right. Critical consciousness is achieved through an in-depth understanding of the world, allowing for the perception and exposure of social and political contradictions. It's embedded in the notion of active learning rather than passive learning, So in doing as opposed to simply absorbing, all right? And Freire draws this big connection between doing and absorbing knowledge, all right? So the process of developing a critical consciousness requires not just ideas and skills and coming to know those and understand them, but also human contact, social interaction, and the ethics of empathy. In other words, to understand your position within the world so that you can face the challenges of this interconnected world. All right. And Freire would argue the wealthy have always had that, the poor have not. They've been controlled in that way. That might be where you think about how your teachers at school treated you. All right. Would you have seen this style of thing? How did that position a teacher? What power did it give them? Did they deserve that power? Did they encourage you to have power? How would learning in this context work? Some people may have had outdoor learning spaces, particularly in primary schools. Maybe you went on excursions or field trips where you've had much more independence and group work and things like that. So Freire structures his kind of pedagogy around a sequence of distinct stages. So these distinct stages are about moving you up into critical consciousness. It's been critiqued in different ways, but Freire does say this isn't a rigid process. It's not linear. You can move back and forward. You may have different stages at different points at the same point in time about different ideas. But it's a good way of kind of explaining this process that we're hoping you go through. So the first stage where we kind of all start off is what he refers to as magical consciousness. So this is where people feel inferior to facts and events that are bigger than them. These facts and events are experienced as having been commanded by a superior force or supernatural power. So fatalism, destiny, God, etc. There's no point as somebody in this level of consciousness is you are at the mercy of these things. You can pray that they do the right thing, but what happens is going to happen. All right. We're going to jump through to the third one, which is naive transitive consciousness. So this is where you've moved out of that fatalistic perspective, so away from disengagement to a process of engagement. All right. So this is where people begin to feel superior to facts and events. I am a person that is more than these ideas or this knowledge or this history or these actions, because I'm able to reflect on them and to kind of develop my own ideas about them. So naive transitive consciousness is moving through this stage, but it's still a tendency to simplify problems, to accept received ideas rather than to question them. All right, so you're starting to question, but they're not. From that point, people may go backwards. So they've developed a little bit of insight in that superiority to the facts and events. They become engaged, but not totally going back to magical consciousness, but a sense of fanatical consciousness. So this is where people are dominated by a powerful myth and act on the basis of emotion rather than reason. All right. They have a false belief in individual choice. I am choosing to do something. So the false belief in the sense that they're really not choosing. They're still directed objects. And this is what Freire calls massification. Right? So you may have chosen your subjects at school to study, but not really because you're influenced by what the government wants you to learn. Or the combination of subjects that will get you a good ATAR. All right. Even at university, most of you in your degrees will have had a set program of study. You must do all of these, social science core, for example. You'll have a scattering of electives, which are designed to make you more interesting, but then you kind of get directed into those too, or you end up doing the same thing. You all become clones rather than individuals who will stand up for what they believe in. All right. So the end point, which we're hoping you'll get to by the end, is your critical consciousness. All right. So this is when we move beyond the superficial a person seeks to go into, to go under, to understand, to go to the roots of, to unveil, to investigate, and be willing to test their findings. All right. So in critical consciousness, we're open to revision. We're seeking to avoid preconceptions. We're accepting responsibility for our learning. So we're moving away from spoon-fed. And that may be why that when you ask me questions, I'll go, it's in the learning guide or it's on views. That's your responsibility to be able to negotiate the path. Critical consciousness is dialogical rather than polemical. Right, so it's about a conversation between you and us and knowledge and society and questioning and things like that. All right, so you're not just absorbing, you're there. So in this sense, communication in its various forms is a collaborative search for the truth. All right, and in this unit, investigating and communicating social problems, you're using communication to explore and develop people's interest in what is really happening in the world. All right. There are many different ways that we do that, but communication is about more than me, more than you. It is about our audience, the actual audience, the intended audience, the hoped for audience. All right. Communication is always two-way. Otherwise, it's just lecturing. Okay. So, sorry, clicked one there. I'm going to cover the TARP framework now. So the TARP framework underpins the unit and it underpins your Praxis journal assignment. And I will come back to these assignments in the these concepts in the Praxis journal video. So the TARP framework is about theory, action, and process. All right. So conscientization, the process of developing critical consciousness, is at the heart of liberatory education. So it differs from conscious raising. All right. So it's not just becoming conscious. In that conscious raising may involve transmission of pre-selected knowledge. All right. On the other hand, critical consciousness means engaging in praxis in which one both reflects and takes action on their social reality to break through the prevailing mythologies, dichotomies, paradigms, etc., the things that tell you you must be this because of all of this. All right, so perhaps your culture tells you you must be a wife and a mother. Critical consciousness is about going, yes, I might be a wife and a mother, but this is why I am that, and this is what I really wish that I was. All right, perhaps the world tells you that you're stupid and you didn't get a good ATAR and you've had to struggle to get to uni. Critical consciousness is about I am more than my marks. Right? Nobody cares about my marks in university. What people care about is my ability and interest to engage. All right, so that's critical consciousness. Engaging in praxis, the development of critical consciousness, these new levels of awareness, in particular the awareness of oppression, those are all part of that process. All right. So the process of conscientization involves identifying contradictions and experience through dialogue and becoming part of the process of changing the world. So education is a cognitive experience requiring thought and action and a critical examination or reflection of the self, right? So this is how we get to praxis. So theory, which is the knowledge that exists already, the ideas, the skills, the things that you normally just get given passively. There's still a sense of engaging in that, but action is part of that process, the doing, the things that you do to learn, right? So being actively involved in your learning. And then reflection, right? That self-awareness. How is this important to me? How does this change me? How has this empowered me in this different context? All right. And constantly what we'll be asking for in the Praxis journal is that critical consciousness. All right. How have I become more aware of myself, where I was, where I am, and where I can now go? All right. So theory. So the true intellectual finds the courage to seek the truth beyond ego or beyond the self or fixed notions of the nature of things. All right. So fact learning, the uncritical learner, reads a book, writes down the meanings of words, memorizes it all, probably does super well in an exam, but doesn't really move beyond that. All right. How is the book wrong? What one dimension of a thing does the textbook give you? All right. In this unit, there's no textbooks because the textbook is going to constrain us. Instead, I want you to find more, have an academic adventure if you want. So theory-based learning is about the critical comprehension of what we already know. Intellectual acts of learning, which are the deliberate acts of thinking about ideas and critical ideas that already exist or are coming into being. So within this unit, this is your learning and engagement with the knowledge-based context, ideas that already exist or come from other people. All right, so this is the readings that you do, the videos that you watch like this one, where we're discussing what we already know about the key ideas. This is only one part, all right? Don't fall into the trap of doing that only, right? So alongside that is your active learning or the process of action. So sometimes Freire refers to this as activism, not in the political sense, but in the deliberate act of doing something, all right? So consciously learning through activities or questioning things, being actively engaged. So we could see this as the practice of being in the world, not just sponging in the world. We have the concept of experiential learning. And if we're talking about experiential learning, your experience is going to be unique because of who you are and what you bring into that and how you experience. All right. So the creation of knowledge through actively engaging with the process of learning. So this is your active participation and engagement with the learning community, either individually or independently, or as a group in the classroom. All right. And it's about creating knowledge through doing, learning skills through doing, developing and becoming more empowered. All right. So here we're asking questions about what the activities that really gelled with you. What did they ask you? How did you contribute to them? How did you develop out of them? How did your peers work with you? All right. Why did you work that way? All right. So that's the action part. And then we have reflection. All right. And reflection, that's particularly self-reflection or the development of insight of the self, is central to the process of developing critical consciousness. All right. So you cannot skip the reflection stage. So this can simply mean the ability to reflect on our reflections. So that mirroring back and forward, it's not once off, it's several times. I think this, why do I think that? Because of this, but this, all right? So that conversation in your head, going ever deeper under the microscope to examine our attitudes, assumptions, and prejudices in order to open ourselves to new insights and understandings. So you can see a reflection as an inner dialogue that helps us develop knowledge as an exploration of both an internal and external reality. It's impossible to engage critically in the outer world without this inner critical self-reflection. All right, so we can't critique our practices in our bigger academic, professional, and personal worlds without first critiquing how we internally, I guess, develop ideas and awareness. So the initial moment of transformation, so the initial point at which there is a development of consciousness, is when one begins to think critically about the self and identify the self and how it comes about in relation to one's political circumstance. All right, so this is where we begin to develop an understanding of why we are hungry, all right, beyond that we have not eaten, right? So maybe it is that we've been given poor quality food, or because somebody else has restricted our access to food, or because climate change has made the crops fail, or because of COVID lockdown, all we got were a can of baked beans, all right, or a loaf of bread. So critical reflection or that insight is about becoming aware of your development, of your understanding, of your empowerment because of your learning, right? So that looking afresh. Where does this all lead? To the concept of praxis. So praxis is about the development and empowerment beyond the traditional structures of elite education. It is the key concept that comes out of Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. And praxis is concerned with how we put learning into practice, right? So the prax part is to do Latin for practice. We use the term praxis to say more than my doing work, but also my thought about it, right? So the critical reflection is built into that. Critical consciousness in the art of practicing. So others frame this as practical wisdom in a more, I guess, friendly language. So it's a union of theory, practice, and critical thinking. The insistence on the independent nature of theory and fact, coupled with the awareness that knowledge cannot be separated from experience, right? So this awareness that knowledge is rooted in experience shapes what we value, how we know what we know, how we use what we know, all right? Some of you will be going, I don't know why we did, I did economics in high school. I haven't used anything since. It would have been better if they taught me how to apply for a loan or do financial literacy rather than how to set up a company, all right? So when we're talking about practice, we're talking about awareness, we're talking about the experiences, about how theory links with our actions, and how we're reflecting on that. So praxis is about learning to reflect, to broaden our vision so that we can see the whole picture, and apply that learning in a certain context. So praxis is not a blind action, it is action and it's reflection. People are human beings, so kind of makes sense. Because they are historically constituted as beings of praxis. In other words, what makes us human is the ability to critically think and apply knowledge in different contexts because we're aware of our experiences. Freire would argue that if we don't have that critical consciousness, if we're not reflecting, we don't have this practical wisdom, then we're simply like robots doing what others tell us to do, right? So in the process of developing our praxis, we become capable of transforming the world, of giving it meaning. So we're coming back to that meaning making, all right? So praxis is reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. And in this context, and in this unit particularly, we say both students and teachers are being transformed, right? So I cannot teach this unit without learning something from all of you. Having experiences, being critically conscious and reflecting on the process. And that's all part of my pedagogy, is to write down my reflections after each class, after each module, my thought process in this. So praxis is the process by which a theory, lesson, or skill is enacted, embodied, or realized. When considering the development of your own praxis, you are looking for how theory and action combine and what your thoughts are about that. You're placing an emphasis beyond the immediacy of readings, online activities, and class lines, time, identifying the transformations you have made and how you got there, and how it might apply to your academic, personal, or professional development. All right. So the key part here when we talk about praxis is we want to see your development and empowerment of your personal, academic, and professional self. That's what your praxis journal is about. Okay, so to recap, the key concepts or ideas we've covered in this video, we've learned about Paulo Freire, and his critique of traditional education as a banking model of education, where you just put all the coins in the money bank and hope the money bank becomes smart. 2, an idea of education as about consciousness, critical consciousness, self-awareness, and freedom from that as a result of consciousness. We discussed what critical consciousness what critical consciousness is, and where it comes from, the different stages, and it'd be interesting for you to think about those as they apply to you. And then we covered the TARP framework that it underscores this unit. So theory, action, reflection, and praxis is practical wisdom that allows you to apply knowledge, develop yourself, and become more empowered as a result of that critical consciousness. So there's various readings for you to choose from. The consolidation task for this section gets you to explore literacy, so one version of learning, and citizenship. I know some people are going to hate me, but I've got you to read a little short 5-page commentary on the joy of reading. We're going to think about what it is literacy and what its purpose is in academic, professional, and everyday life. And I want you to think about how literacy fits with the ideas of Paulo Freire, specifically why literacy is important for that development of the critical consciousness. Thanks for joining me in this lecture pod, and I look forward to seeing you in some more.